First of all, I would like to emphasize that the majority of the German photographs shown, dating from 1933 to 1945, were produced for propaganda purposes, as was practiced by all state institutions worldwide at that time. Regardless of that, they are valuable as documents because they allow us to look into a time that is almost 100 years in the past. The first National Political Education Institute, officially called NPEA or popularly known as NAPOLA, was founded on the 20th April 1933 in Plön, also on Hitler's 44th birthday, and opened on May 1st. In 1933, the NPEA's Köslin in Pomerania and Potsdam followed. Students at the NAPOLAs graduated with the Abitur. They were supposed to serve as elite schools, modeled after ancient Sparta British elite schools like Eton and the Prussian Cadet Corps. By 1945, a total of 43 NAPOLAs had been established throughout the entire Reich, 40 for boys and 3 for girls. One was initially in Vienna on Börhafgasse, which was then moved to Schloss Hubertendorf and later to Auhof near Tönitz. Kulmarberg in Luxembourg. Here are some impressions of school life. The third one was in Illenau in Aachen, but it was soon moved to the confiscated Benedictine Abbey Schweigelberg near Wilshofen in Bavaria, then returned to Aachen and moved into the school building of the Hegne Monastery on Lake Constance in May 1943. Finally, there was also a Napola Reich School for girls in Eindhoven, Holland, which I will discuss in more detail later. But even though all Napolas are lumped together today due to research, laziness, and ignorance, they were not comparable to the SS Junker schools founded in 1934, like the first one here in Bad Tölz, which were more comparable to those responsible for officer cadet training, the Army's officer schools, and also not with the 12 boarding school like Adolf Hitler schools, AHS, for so-called Ordensjunker, which were under the authority of the Gauleiters, which were founded in January 1937 by the head of the German Labor Front, DRF, Dr. Robert Ley, who took his own life in Nuremberg on October 25, 1945. And in 1937, together with the abdicated King of Great Britain, Edward VIII, the Duke of Windsor, and the leader of the Hitler Youth, who was sentenced to 20 years in prison in Nuremberg, Baldur von Schirach. Just as reports about school life have always often differed greatly in content, this is also the case with the memories of the Napola students. This was also because there wasn't just one Napola, but they differed from location to location in their academic focus and the customs practiced there. And of course, there was also the shock for many boys after the outbreak of war in 1939, which came as a surprise to most after many of their teachers were drafted and replaced by staff who were not always suitable, who then increasingly introduced purely military content such as shooting, Morse code, war games, and so on. By the way, the cadets at the military academies had similar experiences starting in 1914, after their military instructors went to the front and were replaced by older civilian teachers. But it is also an undeniable fact that in retrospect, many Napola students spoke positively about their experiences. Many of them also had remarkable careers after World War II, especially in the Federal Republic, in politics, business, the military, arts, culture, and sports. Like Rudiger von Weckmar, who attended the Napola Berlin Spandau from 1935 to 1941, in the 1970s and 1980s, ambassador of the Federal Republic at the UN and in Rome and London.
Or Heinz Dewar, the entrepreneur and manager, and among other things, head of the German Federal Railways, who was a student at the NPEA Schopforte from 44 to 45.
Lieutenant General Leopold Kalupa, student in Naumburg from 1940 to 1945, from October 1983, Supreme, Commander, Allied Forces, Central Europe. The draftsman, graphic artist, and photographer Horst Janssen from 1942 at the NPEA Emsland in Hasselünne.
Or the journalist and film and literature critic Helmut Karasek,
from 1941 to 1944, student at the NPEA in Upper Silesian Lublinitz, which was called Luben from 1941 to 1945.
Finally, the sports official Rolf Andressen, among other things, president and honorary member of the German Volleyball Association from 1936 to 1943 at the NPEA Plönen.
He is listed on Wikipedia under the section Napola, served from 1973 to 1992, Theo Sommer, who served as editor of Die Zeit, as well as the actor mentioned there, Hardy Krüger, were not students at an NPEA, but at an Adolf Hitler school, in their case, the Ordensburg Sonthof. Here is my video about the NS Ordensburg and its transformation into Army NCO School 1. Nor was Alfred Herrhausen, who is also mentioned there, after the war, chairman of the board of Deutsche Bank and murdered on November 30, 1989. Either by members of the communist Baader-Meinhof gang, the Stasi of the GDR, or the so-called Palestinian Liberation Front. He was actually at the Reichsschule Feldafing from 1942, which on the 1st
of April 1934 had been founded as the National Socialist German High School Starnberger See. From 1938, it was then called the Reichsschule of the Nazi Party Feldafing, RSF,
and had nothing to do with the Napola. Subtitles. Even if a South German newspaper writes under this picture, the historical photo shows Reich Minister Ernst Röhm at the inauguration of the National Political Education Institute, for short, Napola, which just goes to show you how everything is now being mixed together and adds even more to the general confusion. I had already mentioned the reference to the role models of the NPIS. I also mentioned the history of the Prussian Cadet Institute, whose tradition goes back to the Knight Academy established in 1653 in Kolberg, Western Pomerania, by the great Elector. But when, on June 28, 1919, the German delegation in Versailles, according to France's demands on that very day, exactly 5 years after the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne and his wife, the German delegation was virtually forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles. Not only was the long disproved sole war guilt imposed on the German Reich, along with other provisions, including these territorial losses, but it was also more or less demilitarized with the support of the Reich government. This also included the dissolution of the 228-year-old Saxon Cadet Corps, the 164-year-old Bavarian, as well as the 205-year-old Prussian Cadet Corps. In the First World War alone, starting from the beginning of the war on the 1st,
August 1914, out of the 739 members of the main Cadet Institute Großlichterfelde West who joined their military units, 373 were killed,
which means more than half. In Prussia, until their forced dissolution, 8 preparatory corps, the so-called cadet preparatory institutions, later called cadet houses, each with 2 companies totaling 1,690 cadets in Potsdam, Wahlstatt in Lower Silesia, Bensberg, Prussian Rhine province, Oranienstein, Prussian province of Nassau, Plön, Prussian province of Schleswig-Holstein, Köslin in West Pomerania. The school had previously been located in Kulm, West Prussia, since 1776, Naumburg-Saale, Prussian province of Saxony, as well as since 1892, the Royal Prussian Cadet House Karlsruhe in Baden. the only one of the 8 Prussian preparatory corps outside of Prussia. Finally, the main Cadet Institute Berlin-Lichterfelde, inaugurated on September 1, 1878. The motto, Prussian obedience, stems from free choice, not submissive servility. The main Cadet Institute, with its 1,000 cadets admitted from the 10th grade onward in 10 companies, was considered one of the best military schools worldwide. Anyone who wants to learn more about the life, the training, and the end of the main Cadet Institute in Berlin-Lichterfelde West may want to watch this video. The Prussian Cadet Corps, 1717 to 1920, Critique and Appreciation, and the book by the former cadet and later writer Ernst von Salomon.
In his almost documentary-style novel from 1933, The Cadets, he praises the education received there and expresses his regret over the ban on cadet institutions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles with impressive words.
From 1933, the former main Cadet Institute housed the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and from 1947, the US Army, now the Federal Archives. After the ban on cadet institutes, these facilities were converted into state educational institutions, the so-called Stabiles. There were no cadet institutes in the Weimar Republic. They were only re-established as national political educational institutions with the beginning of the Third Reich. The reason for this was that Hitler had taken over an intact administration and functioning state structures. But since the newly created Reich was supposed to last forever, he wanted to replace the old leadership with a new one as soon as possible. From now on, according to the guidelines, young people were to be educated in the National Socialist spirit. And since women were not intended for the upper levels of state leadership, there were, for example, the Napolas. Except for the 3 mentioned, they were reserved exclusively for boys from the age of 10 and young men who had proven their intellectual ability and especially their athleticism. In the early years, the NPEAs were under the authority of the severely alcoholic, and on
May 8, 1945, the Reich Minister for Science, Education, and Public Instruction, Bernhard Rust, who died by suicide, passed away. By 1935, there were 15 NAPOLAs. By 1938, there were 21, including 4 in Austria and 1 in the Sudetenland.
However, the idea for this type of school had already been conceived earlier by the SA, who, after the Nazis came to power in 1934, was appointed inspector of the state administration of the NAPOLAs. SA-Sturmbannführer Dr. Joachim Haupt.
However, since he was considered a close friend of the homosexual SA Chief of Staff Ernst Röhm,
who was murdered in June 1934, along with other SA leaders by SS commandos during the so-called SA coup, which was allegedly planned and named after him, Haupt had only narrowly escaped being murdered himself. Later, however, he was arrested and dismissed from all his positions and the party. The main reason for this being
that he wanted to maintain the NAPOLAs as a state institution and prevent their takeover by the Hitler Youth and the SS.
So it happened that the schools, which until 1936 were under the Reich Ministry of Science, Education and Public Instruction since the 9th
March 1936, belonged to the inspector of the National Political Educational Institutions under SS Obergruppenführer August Heissmeyer.
By 1940, the SS had taken complete control over the NAPOLAs and had sole authority over curricular and staffing decisions. They were also responsible for selecting the new so-called young men and their principals and teachers. They were required to join the General SS. An interesting episode, often forgotten today, was the student exchange program adopted in the summer of 1935 between leading American and German schools. Under the fellowship founded in 1927 by the principal of Tabor Academy in Massachusetts, Walter Houston Lillard founded the so-called International Schoolboy Fellowship, where the exchange of students was intended to promote better relations between nations. The participating countries included the USA, France, Great Britain, and Germany. Many leading elite private schools in the USA, so-called prep schools, participated in the Napola exchange program after 1935, such as Phillips Academy Andover in Massachusetts and Phillips Academy Exeter in New Hampshire, also schools in Delaware, Connecticut, and New Jersey. Between 1936 and 1938, 15 American students each year completed a 10-month stay at the Nazi elite schools. While in return, 30 Napola students each spent 5 months at the American schools. It was taken for granted that both sides repeatedly tried to convey the superiority of their own system. With the outbreak of the war, the exchange program was terminated. In Germany, in order to find students suitable for attending a Napola, elementary schools had to submit the boys from the 3rd grade, whom they considered suitable, every November 1st, and 4th grade to the responsible school authority, which would then forward this recommendation to the nearest NPEA. Since there were always significantly more applicants than available spots, the selection criteria were strict. Particular importance was also placed on the so-called Aryan descent of the applicant, his state of health, as well as character and personality. People who wore glasses were not accepted. If the parents could not pay the school fees, the school administration covered the costs, which were about 50 Reichsmarks per minute on. There are always new reports to be read in modern German about the supposed existence of a National Socialist orientation at that time. The boys are probably a result of such propaganda images, because a 9 or 10-year-old boy hardly had the intellectual capacity for that. Rather, the boys were enthusiastic about uniforms and pseudo-military bearing. That wasn't difficult for them either, since they had plenty of role models in their fathers ever since the militarization of the parties that began in the Weimar Republic. In this, the SPD, now often conveniently forgotten, played a part with the Reichsbanner Schwarz-Rot-Gold. With up to 3 million members, it was the largest organization, including at least 250,000 men in its combat units, the Schutzformationen or Schufos. On average, each Napola received around 400 applicants per year, of whom about 100 were accepted after a week-long entrance examination, who were then assigned to a Napola at the start of the school year. There, both teachers and students wore uniforms, initially those of the Hitler Youth, then from August 1934 onwards. An olive green uniform with a 4-pocket tunic, prayer triangle, belt, district triangle, belt buckle with the inscription Blood and Honor, trousers, a khaki-colored shirt, and a black tie. The individual schools were distinguished by the color of their shoulder boards and the initials NPAA. While the students coming from the Hitler Youth wore their Hitler Youth knives, which were not actually part of the uniform, but could be purchased by anyone for 4 Reichsmarks. The HJ knives were allowed to be worn on the back left hip, with the engraved motto Blood and Honor on the blade. Their teachers wore a service dagger with the engraving. The Prussian motto coined by Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke the Elder, to be more than to seem. For the teachers, in addition to professional competence, leadership skills were required. They also had to have reserve officer status, for which the Army offered special courses for teachers without prior military service. The weekly schedule included 37 hours of lessons, with 4 hours each of German, mathematics, English, and Latin. The remaining 13 hours were history and geography, biology, chemistry and physics, art and music. Again and again, the so-called ideological training was incorporated into the lessons, as well as racist viewpoints. Religious education or church visits, like those at the cadet institutions of the German monarchies, did not take place. That's why the motto of the NPRA Bensberg is surprising. As was always emphasized by the party on every occasion, special emphasis was also placed on this in the school classes. On the promotion of camaraderie,
physical courage and sense of duty, as well as self-discipline, willingness to make sacrifices, and a sense of belonging to the Volksgemeinschaft. For physical education, which was still called physical training, until the 1960s, 8 hours per week were scheduled. In addition to track and field, it included rowing, boxing, fencing, swimming, gliding, and horseback riding. Older students could obtain a driver's license for motorcycles and motor vehicles. In addition, under the supervision of Wehrmacht officers, there were also regular marksmanship exercises and orienteering marches that ended with tent camps around a campfire. Just like at the state high schools with their modern language or classical tracks, or the real gymnasium that existed until the 1960s with a focus on mathematics or science, there were also similar specialized schools at the Napolas. However, there was a glaring difference compared to the state high schools, because in addition to the military organization, instead of classes, there were platoons. And as it was said, to protect them from the temptations of class arrogance, they were mandatory for students of the younger grades. To spend a certain period on a farm, while older students, for example, were assigned to work in a mine or a factory. As we found today, in the highest class, the Oberprima, the written and oral exams for obtaining the general university entrance qualification took place. After that, every student was free to choose any course of study they wanted. In total, a little more than 15,000 young people between the ages of 10 and 18 have been educated at the Napola schools, but that only makes up a small percentage in the German secondary school system from 1933 to 1945. However, the Napolas did not see themselves as competitors to the existing school system, but rather as a supplement similar to the cadet institutions in Imperial Germany. It is also noteworthy that in the Netherlands, which had been occupied since 1942, so-called Napola Reich schools were established, such as the one in 1942 in Valkenburg an der Göll in the province of Limburg. Half a year later, on July 9, 1942, the Reich School for Girls was opened in part of the St. Elizabeth Convent in Heidhuizen near Roermond, led by the Dutch Baroness Julia Andrea Opter-Nord. And although she was not very successful as a principal, that was not the reason Reichsführer SS Himmler ordered her recall to Germany in September 1943, quote, for a special assignment. Not due to her pedagogical incompetence, but rather that the unmarried Baroness was given the opportunity in a so-called Lebensborn home to give birth to a healthy boy on February 26, 1944, who was given the name Heinrich, since it was rumored that Heinrich Himmler was his father. On September 1, 1943, the so-called Reichsschule of Flanders was also opened in the small village of Kortrecht-Wetteren near Ghent in Belgium. When the front approached at the end of August 1944, it was first relocated to the Napola Ballenstedt, then to Streichow Castle in Styria. At the end of October, to Wulstein Castle, about 75 kilometers southwest of Posen, today called Poznan in Polish. However, by then, the majority of the approximately 120 students between the ages of 10 and 14 had already returned to Germany by various means. After the occupation of Germany by the US Army, they were brought back to Belgium, where their parents were already in prison for collaboration. After a short stay in Brussels, the former Napola students were then transferred to Rooslede in West Flanders, where they were subjected to a re-education program that lasted up to 13 months. As for the older cohorts at the Napolas during the war years, many had volunteered for the branches of the Wehrmacht or the Waffen-SS, with a number of them having been killed in action. However, many former students have also reported that the institution directors in 1945 took considerable care of their wards
and often protected them from being sent to the front.
After losing the war, the Allied Control Council, through Control Council Law, Number 34, issued on August 20, 1946, prohibited the establishment of cadet schools on German soil.
However, the GDR did not comply with this ban and in 1956 established a cadet school in the former Prussian Cadet Institute in Naumburg-Saale, which later became a Napola, a cadet school. Here is one of the uniform shoulder boards. In 1960, the National People's Army Cadet School was closed again. With that, the chapter of cadet institutions in Germany was over for good. Only street signs and memorial stones remind us of it.